Hello, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let people time to come in from the waiting room. I always like it when people tell us where they are. So we are in Berkeley, and I'm affiliated with UC Davis. So we have people from Davis. Yasemin is here from LA. Karina, where are you?
In Salt Lake City.
Oh, okay. Frau Grasnova, wo sind Sie eigentlich? Sie sind nicht in Berlin, ne?
In Nürnberg.
Ah, okay.
Das ist meine Heimatstadt.
Ah.
In Nürnberg. Schön.
Let us know in the chat where you are. Washington, Oakland, Berkeley, Vermont, Washington. South Hadley. We're going to give it a couple more minutes. For those who are interested, please notice the product placement, my own form of Schleichwerbung. We have Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit here. Done. And we will hear excerpts from this later on, Der verlorene Sohn. And of course, we also have the first one. Yes, we can do a share here. We're shameless in the way we promote. So we'll wait another couple minutes. Portland, Oregon, people from Montreal, from Maine, Toronto. Nice crowd. All right, maybe we can get started. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Elisabeth Grimmer. I'm affiliated with UC Davis. I also want to introduce the co-organizer of this event, Deniz Göktürk. Deniz, you want to say hi to everybody? Wave. Hello. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors, in particular, the German consulate in San Francisco, but also the Pacific branch of the German Historical Institute. And in particular, I want to thank the little pink square that where you can't see a face. It's Ray Savord, and he is our Zoom master and handles all Zoom-related matters for us. And I'm so grateful for that because it really is a huge load off for us. So let's dive right in. Welcome to our conversation with Olga Grasnova. The title is The Power of Multilingualism, Writing Across Cultures. And we will first have an introduction by Karina Deifel. Karina was a student at UC Davis at the institution where I work, and she actually wrote her dissertation on female writers from the former Soviet Union who write in German. So she's ideally qualified to introduce Frau Grasnova. So the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and also everyone else for organizing this event. So, as Elisabeth said, today's lectures is centered around the topic of the power of multilingualism. And Olga Gryaznova's journey started as a multilingualist at the age of 11 when she moved in 1996 with her family from Baku, Azerbaijan to Germany. And the background for that event was that her family belonged to the 200,000 Russian of Jewish descent who were granted German citizenship. And that's how this beautiful journey started for her. She studied also in Göttingen, art history and Slavic studies, and she graduated in 2010 from the Institute of Literature in Leipzig, and her degree was in creative writing, which was also the foundation for her successful career as a fictional writer. And in 2012, she published her first novel, with the title Der Russe ist einer, der Birken liebt.
Karina, sorry, can you speak up? Some people, I think, are having trouble hearing you. Maybe if you lean in a bit. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no, thank you for letting me know that my audio is kind of weak. So the English title for the translation for the novel was All Russians Love Birch Trees. And for that novel, she also received 2 awards, the Klaus Michael Kühne Prize and the Anna Segers Prize. Is the audio okay? Okay. Since then, she published 3 other novels, Die juristische Unschärfe einer Ehe, and that was in 2014, Und Gott ist nicht schüchtern in 2019. It was translated into English with the title The City of Jasmine. And in 2020, she published her last novel, Der verlorene Sohn, and we will hear an excerpt from that novel today. Among others, she has lived in Poland, Russia, Turkey, Israel, and England, and she was there a writer of residence in the University of Oxford and the University of Warwick. And in her recent publication, which we also will hear from, Die Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit über Herkunft und Vielfalt, this is a critical essay arguing that multilingualism has always been part of human experience, and it's not something new and exceptional, but it also parallels with her last novel, Der verlorene Sohn, where you have a similar topic. And also that German society needs to rethink its bias towards certain languages. Olga Gryaznova lives in Berlin with her husband and her daughter, and she's switching languages on a daily basis. She speaks English with her husband, Russian with her daughter, and German with us readers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Karina, very much for the introduction. I hope the audio is okay. Okay, great. I will first start to read a little bit from Die Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit in German, just to avoid speaking English as far as I can. And then we will have hopefully Ambika Atiraya. I hope I don't mispronounce it, just to read an expert of the English translation.
Fine.
More or less. I will start just at the beginning, so I think it's quite easy to follow, or at least I hope so. Sprachenwechsel und Migration haben in meiner Familie in jeder Generation stattgefunden, wenn auch die Migration nicht immer freiwillig war. Meine Großmutter mütterlicherseits floh von der Shoah, fast ihre gesamte Familie wurde von den Deutschen ermordet. Und schon die Generationen vor ihr waren vor antisemitischen Pogrom im Ansiedlungsrayon des russischen Kaiserreiches geflohen. Die Muttersprache meiner Großmutter war Jiddisch. Sie sprach zudem Russisch und nach ihrer Flucht von Weißrussland nach Aserbaidschan lernte sie Azeri, wenn auch nicht sehr gut. Die Herkunft der Familie meines Vaters wurde verschleiert. Irgendwo aus der Wolga-Ebene kam sie nach Baku, wie so viele andere, in Zeiten des Erdölbooms. Meine Mutter und mein Vater wurden in eine mehrsprachige Gesellschaft hineingeboren, sprachen jedoch überwiegend Russisch und nur bescheiden Aserbaidschanisch. Auch die Paten ihrer Geschwister, meine angeheirateten Onkel und Tanten, stammen alle aus bilingualen Familien und waren mit Russisch, Aserbaidschanisch, Persisch oder Polnisch aufgewachsen. Dieser Umstand galt in Baku als völlig normal und wurde nicht verhandelt. Baku war zu der Zeit eine multikulturelle Stadt. Auf den Straßen hörte man Russisch, Aserbaidschanisch, Georgisch, Armenisch, Persisch, Griechisch und viele andere Sprachen. Die Muttersprache meiner Mutter war Russisch und nicht mehr Jiddisch. Als meine Mutter vor einigen Jahren die Serie Stitzel, die größtenteils auf Jiddisch gedreht worden ist, anschaute, war sie dennoch begeistert. Nicht so sehr von der Serie selbst, sondern von dem warmen Gefühl, dass mehr und mehr jiddische Ausdrücke in ihr Bewusstsein zurückkehrten. Ausdrücke, die sie während ihrer Kindheit täglich gehört hatte und an die sie sich schon lange nicht mehr aktiv erinnerte. Machtverhältnisse und Nationalismus spiegeln sich stets in der Sprache wider, genauso wie die jeweils herrschenden Diskurse und Ideologien. Man kann sich noch heute selbst in den entlegenen Dörfern im Kaukasus oder in Zentralasien auf Russisch verständigen. Allerdings ist dies dem Umstand geschuldet, dass Russisch nicht nur eine wunderschöne, sondern auch eine imperiale Sprache ist. Die Dominanz der russischen Sprache in Baku war insofern politisch gewollt. Daran lag es auch, dass ich niemals richtig Aserbaidschanisch gelernt habe. Wir sprachen die Sprache des Imperiums und das war damals genug. Aserbaidschanisch umgab mich jeden Tag, in den Wohnungen der Nachbarn und unseren Freundinnen, auf der Straße und in der Schule. Dort besuchte ich eine russischsprachige Klasse. Aserbaidschanisch wurde zwar von der ersten Klasse an unterrichtet, allerdings nicht sonderlich gut. Neben den russischsprachigen Klassen wie meiner gab es auch andere, in denen nur auf Aserbaidschanisch unterrichtet wurde. In der Regel waren das zwei getrennte Welten. Die Klassen, die auf Russisch unterrichtet wurden, waren privilegiert. Die Kinder, die sie besuchten, stammten aus sozial etwas gehobenen Schichten und hatten Eltern mit deutlich höheren Bildungsabschlüssen. Russisch war in der gesamten Sowjetunion die dominante Bildungs- und Kommunikationssprache. Viele aserbaidschanischsprachige Familien fingen im Laufe der Zeit an, ebenfalls untereinander Russisch zu sprechen. Obwohl die Sowjetunion eine klassenlose Gesellschaft sein sollte, zeigte der Abstand der nicht-russischen Muttersprachlerinnen zu der eigenen Herkunftssprache und Kultur gewonnen hatten, auch die eigene soziale Klasse an. Je mehr und akzentfreier man also Russisch sprach, desto eher gehörte man der Intelligenz an. Russisch wurde mit Kultur gleichgesetzt. Alles Nationale war dagegen eher verpönt, zumindest alles, was nicht Russisch war. Ich bin im Jahr 1996 im Alter von 11 Jahren mit meiner Familie aus Aserbaidschan nach Deutschland ausgewandert. Von da an wurde ich auf Deutsch sozialisiert, sodass ich das Deutsche heute um einiges besser beherrsche als meine russische Muttersprache. Die Muttersprache meiner Kinder ist Deutsch. Und wenn ich mit ihnen Russisch spreche, auch wenn ich mit ihnen Russisch spreche und mein Mann Arabisch, mit meinem Mann spreche ich Englisch. So fühlen wir uns am wohlsten. Er ist 2013 aus Syrien nach Deutschland gekommen und auch in der Geschichte seiner Familie spielt Mehrsprachigkeit eine große Rolle, wie wahrscheinlich in sehr vielen Familien auf dieser Welt. Wir haben ebenfalls keine gemeinsame Familiensprache mehr und sind bei weitem keine Ausnahme. Mittlerweile kann ich mit dem Konzept der Muttersprache nur noch bedingt etwas anfangen, denn in der Translationswissenschaft, der Wissenschaft vom Übersetzen und Dolmetschen, verwendete Einordnung in A-, B- und C-Sprachen leuchtet mir viel mehr ein. Sie ist näher an meiner Lebenswirklichkeit. Die A-Sprache ist demnach die Mutter- oder Erstsprache oder einfach die Sprache, die man am besten beherrscht. In diese besetzt man entsprechend aus den B- oder C-Sprachen. Die Unterscheidung ist frei von Ideologie und Wertungen und orientiert sich ausschließlich an der Leistung. Also daran, wie gut man eine bestimmte Sprache im Verhältnis zu einer anderen beherrscht.
You understand? We're talking about mother tongue.
There's some interference. I don't know if Ray, can you handle that? Sorry.
Ja, das ist aus einem anderen Kapitel. Okay. Auf dem Zettel, den meine Tochter im Kindergarten bekommen hat und auf dem ihre Deutschkenntnisse beurteilt werden, steht nicht deutsche Herkunftssprache, wie bei so vielen anderen Kindern, die in diesem Land geboren worden sind. In Deutschland werden so 675.000 Kinder und damit 21,4% aller Kindergartenkinder etikettiert. In Berlin sind es sogar 31%. Ich könnte diesen Zettel aus dem Kindergarten eigentlich als eine hübsche Anekdote abtun. Denn obwohl ich mit meiner Tochter Russisch spreche und mein Mann Arabisch, antwortet sie uns fast ausschließlich auf Deutsch. Mit ihrem Bruder spricht sie ebenfalls nur Deutsch. So wie übrigens auch ich mit meinem. Der Befund nicht deutsche Herkunftssprache ist leider nicht so harmlos, wie er klingt. Es kann vielmehr schnell zu einer Diagnose werden. Als NDH abgekürzt, sorgt diese dann zum Beispiel dafür, dass viele Eltern ihre Kinder auf einer Schule, die einen hohen Anteil an NDH-Schülerinnen aufweist, gar nicht erst anmelden. Eine Einstellung, die mir im Kulturbetrieb oft begegnet. Wir sind umgezogen, unser Kind sollte eingeschult werden und an unserer Einzugsschule waren zu viele Ausländer. Solche Sätze höre ich immer wieder. Ich war übrigens auch solch eine Schülerin, auch wenn es den Begriff NDH damals noch nicht gab. NDH ist ein gesellschaftliches Urteil. Oft werden damit Armut, Bildungsferne und Halbsprachigkeit assoziiert. Denn obwohl Deutschland sich seit neuestem als Einwanderungsland versteht, wird dieses Selbstverständnis nicht auf die Herkunftssprache ausgedehnt. Die neuen deutschen Medienmacher, ein Zusammenschluss von Medienschaffenden mit und ohne Migrationshintergrund, bezeichnen NDH als den Versuch, Zitat, den Versuch, bestimmte Förderbedürfnisse zu benennen, ohne Kinder einer Herkunftsgruppe zuzuordnen. Leider verbirgt sich dahinter ein defizitorientierter Blick. In der Schuleingangsuntersuchung wird alleine der Frage nachgegangen, ob das Kind die erste Sprache Deutsch gelernt hat. Zitat Ende. Bedeutet es nicht im Klartext, dass ein monolinguales deutschsprachiges Kind automatisch als das Ideal angesehen wird? Bestimmte Formen der Mehrsprachigkeit gelten immer noch als Risiko für den Bildungserfolg. Merkwürdigerweise spricht dabei kaum jemand von den Chancen, die sich nicht nur den bilingualen, sondern allen Kindern eröffnen. Es ist, als würde die Mehrsprachigkeit der einen die Einsprachigkeit der anderen gefährden. Eine solche Denkweise findet sich zum Beispiel in der Kolumne der Berliner Zeitung mit dem Titel Corona, ab wann sind Eltern systemrelevant? Darin schreibt die Journalistin Sabine Rennefanz von einem Freund ihres Sohnes namens Özkan. Zitat. Özkan wohnt im Prenzlauer Berg, heißt es da. Seine Mutter ist in Wendig geboren, sein Vater stammte aus der Türkei. Özkan, ein Experte für BG Masks und Ninjago, ist das einzige türkische Kind in der Kita-Gruppe. Als er zum 5. Geburtstag meines Sohnes eingeladen war, kam er im kompletten Deutschland-Outfit der Fußballnationalmannschaft. Vielleicht dachte er, dass man das so macht, wenn man bei Deutschen eingeladen ist. Ein wenig weiter im Text steht. Mir fiel auf, dass ich nie darüber nachgedacht habe, was die Eltern von Özkan beruflich machen. Und dann noch ein paar Sätze weiter geht es um die Corona-Notbetreuung in den Kindergärten und um eine Zweiklassengesellschaft. Ohne dass beschrieben würde, wie die Autorin zu ihrem Wissen gekommen ist, heißt es, das sind die einen, die systemrelevant sind, also wichtig genug, um entlastet zu werden. Und dann sind da die anderen, Eltern von Kindern wie Özkan, die sowieso schon in der Entwicklung Jahre zurückliegen und die durch die Schließung weiter zurückgeworfen werden. Özkans Eltern leben von Hartz IV. Zu Hause wird nur Türkisch gesprochen, Deutsch hat der Sohn in der Kita gelernt. Wir wissen beim Lesen dieser Kolumne nicht, ob die Autorin tatsächlich mit den Eltern geredet hat oder ob sie es einfach nur gut meint. Selbst wenn Özkan Deutsch in der Kita gelernt hätte, muss es nicht unbedingt das schlechtere Deutsch sein. Und genauso wenig sagt die Tatsache oder eben Nicht-Tatsache seiner sozialen Herkunft irgendetwas über seine kognitiven Fähigkeiten aus. Sie taucht auch nicht als Beweis für seine vermeintlich verzögerte Entwicklung. Özkan wird letztlich alleine seines Namens wegen als Türke inszeniert, obwohl er in Berlin geboren ist und obwohl selbst seine Mutter eine Berlinerin ist. Deutsche Kinder mit anglisierten Namen, und ich meine nicht etwa Kevin oder Cheyenne, sondern Elliot oder Tilda, nicht mehr Tilda, sondern Tilda nach der britischen Schauspielerin und Ikone Tilda Swinton, werden nie als fremd markiert. Özkan wird dagegen nicht einmal die Wahl eines Deutschland-Trikots zugestanden. Stattdessen wird sofort der Gegensatz Deutsche versus Türken bemüht. Dabei könnte man das Ganze auch einfach anders betrachten. Özkan, der deutschen Kindern in seiner Entwicklung voraus ist, weil er bereits 2 Sprachen beherrscht, hat nun genügend Zeit, um sich auf seine Erstsprache zu konzentrieren. Ich gehe davon aus, dass Sabine Rennefanz es mit der Kolumne gut meinte. Doch die darin mitschwingenden Unterstellungen sollten in Deutschland im Jahr 2020 nicht mehr vorkommen. Und vielleicht könnten wir jetzt ein bisschen was auf Englisch hören.
Ja.
Danke.
Danke, Frau Krasnova. a student of Danish, Ambika Athreya, has translated a passage from Die Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit, and we are going to hear that now. Ambika?
Yes, so I'll start with a few. So these don't correspond exactly to what was just read. When I came to Germany at the age of 11, I knew not a word of German save for hands up, which I had picked up from old Soviet films. A week after our arrival deep in the Hessian boondocks, I was sent to school, with no preparation whatsoever. At the local elementary school, I was placed in the 4th grade, even though I was already in the 6th in Baku. This reset, which was apparently supposed to help me with language acquisition, also ensured that I would, for years thereafter, be ashamed of the fact that I was older than most of my classmates. I stressed repeatedly the fact that I had not been held back. In my class were several children from the Home for Asylum Seekers, some of them even older than I was. We were able to communicate among ourselves in English. I had been learning English since 2nd grade and couldn't really keep up with the fluency of the girls from Afghanistan, but limited communication was nevertheless possible. On the other hand, I could not even begin to understand my German-speaking classmates. I was unable to follow in class, and for a long time could not even tell what was the subject being covered. Only in math did I feel myself on firm ground, even if I was puzzled by the fact that algebra and geometry were taught in the same class and not as 2 separate subjects as in Baku. The same with German and literature. I just could not understand how I had landed back in elementary school. My teachers could hardly help. They had neither the means nor the training to do so, and besides, they had to teach the regular classes. The only thing they could find was a binder with some 150 flashcards of objects and everyday scenes, along with German descriptions. This is how I learned German. I wish it upon no one else. I too wrote many letters to government agencies on my parents' behalf and accompanied them to parent-teacher conferences, since they needed help to understand the teachers. During these meetings, I was almost the only child on school premises. I felt ashamed and helpless at the same time. I had a completely different experience much later in Poland as I completed my Erasmus semester in Warsaw. Every time I tried to speak Polish, and I spoke it very badly, people heard me out. Once I even opened a bank account in Polish, 2 hours armed with a dictionary, a stark contrast to what I'd encountered in Germany. I guess it had to do with the fact that I was read as an expat and not as a foreigner. To this day, I marvel at the friendliness of the people in Warsaw. At the same time, I miss Russian, especially the flexible sentence structure and the countless diminutives and suffixes of affect appended to proper nouns. These allow for a nuancing of relationships totally different from what is possible in German. I also like speaking and reading in English. Still, I could not write in either of these languages unless I were to live for an extended period in an English or Russian-speaking country. Then it would be conceivable to switch languages again. I don't really think I speak German with an accent, but I am sure that I write without one. So I was all the more mystified when people routinely classified me as a migration writer after the publication of my first novel in 2012. Beyond that, I did not understand what the concept of migration literature was even supposed to mean. It could not be that all authors with a non-German parent were just thrown into one pot with no regard for aesthetic criteria. I have since sat on many panels intended to deal with this question. I have had long discussions and read varied academic studies on the topic, and still must confess that I do not understand what migration literature is, or if this concept can possibly mean anything other than where one comes from. That's it.
Thank you, Ambika. To lead the discussion today, we have an expert with us on multilingualism, namely Yasemin Yildiz from UCLA. She's an associate professor of German and comparative literature, and she is also the author of a book entitled Beyond the Mother Tongue, the Post-Monolingual Condition. And so Olga and Yasemin will discuss multilingualism.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, for the ability to participate in this conversation. And I wanted to start with the question about what made you write this book now and in this format. And to preface that, we have heard now in those excerpts, for those who don't know the book, that you provide these very rich autobiographical elements in your book, but you also have commentary on media representations of multilingualism. You provide statistics. You also, the book also features a really impressive range of scholarship, very up to date, from linguistics, from literary scholarship, from the field of education, from philosophy. So it's a book of a very interesting format in itself. And it is your first nonfiction book, right? So I was wondering what made you write this book now and what made you choose this format rather than a novelistic fictional format for it?
Well, it was basically Corona. I was asked also by the Duden Publishing House if I would like to write a nonfiction piece for them. And it was clear, then what helped me was that the format was clear and also the number of pages were clear, and I could choose the topic myself. And I was very much interested in the topic of multilingualism because also it's basically what my whole lifestyle is about, even though I didn't really choose this lifestyle. And also we discuss this topic a lot in Germany, and every time it pops up in the discussion, I was getting just super angry. The way how it's treated, also the hierarchy behind it, and also the lack of possibilities of having a chance to raise a kid bilingual if it's neither English or French. Also, even so now I discovered actually how English is taught in Germany, or how English is taught in French in the private kindergartens. Also quite funny, and totally not up to date on the scholar readings. And then basically when I started to do all the research, I discovered your book, which was highly recommended to me, and then I read it, and it was very fascinating to me. And then I basically discovered what the German studies already did wrote about this topic on the multiculturalism. And again, the interesting fact was that all the literature I'm quoting is from US and not from Germany, where the German studies are supposed actually to be or to take place. And I was deeply fascinated by this difference about what we know from German studies in Germany, or what is taught there, and what's happening all over the world, and the gap between it, and also the gap in my education, what I learned about language and language acquisition. And then again, it was it also helped that my first language is Russian, because Russian is more radical than German.
In what way?
For example, I tried to register my daughter 2 weeks ago for additional Russian course, and it wasn't in Berlin, and the teacher in Russian, she yelled at me over the phone. She claimed I'm not a Russian speaker, and since I speak Russian so poorly, it's clear that I couldn't teach my daughter anything. And I wanted her to pay to get to help with the Russian, but also in this whole idea of this clean Russian, or this clean, just translating it into English, having a clean language, a pure Russian, it's much more deeply rooted than even in German. And so it was also interesting for me to compare the cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. I think that last part, that might be worth writing more about, because I don't feel like in the book it's quite as explicit there, but you are really, so nuanced in your accounts of all these different multilingual environments. What we just also heard from your the first part that you read, how you were, excuse me, you grew up in this multilingual environment in Azerbaijan, with a very nuanced, class differentiation of language use and the impact of imperialism. And then when you switch to the German context, you also pay a lot of attention, to poverty and so on, so to class elements, as well as, sorry, losing my voice today, as well as to the function of race, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. But the question that also came up for me for this book, and maybe that's again a very practical issue. Like you said, you wrote this book under Corona as something to do and doable under those circumstances. But I noticed, the book is called The Power of Multilingualism, but it is also, for me, such an incredibly rich archive of the power of monolingualism, because what you provide are so many stories of monolingualization. And some of them, are imposed by others. So the school system does not see these children speaking in bilingually to each other in yet another language. So it's made completely invisible. So it's monolingualized in that form. But also, you have anecdotes of friends who stop teaching their children Russian from one day to the next, which is a form of, monolingualization. And then you have, you tell us the story of this Turkish-German teacher of German who presents herself and her credentials by emphasizing how her husband is German and she will definitely not bring anything foreign into the classroom. And so there's a self-monolingualization. So there are so many aspects of that. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, the co-presence or the tension between, on the one hand, this narrative of the power of multilingualism, but then the stories you keep telling keep constantly giving us a sense for the power of monolingualism.
Yeah, it's true, actually. Also because, first they had another title, but the title was already... there was already a book or on this title, so it was the only title basically which was left. It's because now I think half a year after the publication of this book passed, and sometimes I wonder actually if I don't have a little bit to switch basically my opinion, because I'm not sure if it's actually that clear in the book, but now I tend to think more that of course we have this hierarchy of languages in Germany, but what is actually more also among all the other languages, it depends basically who's speaking the language, not so much which language it actually is, because mostly I think it's just about racism towards the speakers. Maybe it's not that much connected to the language itself, but we're basically just speaking about classism and racism in Germany when we are talking about multiculturalism. It's also for example, when you consider who is regarded a native speaker in English or in French or in Spanish within the German societies, who is having the agency to be to own the language, to own the right to say what is proper French and what is not proper French, who's regarded as a native speaker. And then it's quite clearly who it is and who would never be regarded as it. And also now the demography is changing so fast in Germany, and basically when we are looking to the elementary schools, it's not bilingualism anymore what we're talking about. Most of the kids have now 3 or 4 languages minimum. And again, the whole discussion we're having in Germany, which slowly starts to become kind of normalizing bilingualism, it's again actually behind the society for 30, 40 years, I guess. And now I think when I look in the elementary school, which my daughter is attending, none of the kids, it's a bilingual school for German and Russian, but basically almost nobody's bilingual. All of them are having 3 or 4 languages, which really multiple backgrounds, which I also not discuss because they're just normal for them. And I think the society in Germany and also the multilingualism will change a lot within the next 10 or 15 years. Mm-hmm. But of course, our politics are behind, and the school politics are also behind. But also, after this Corona crisis and in the middle of a new one, it's very difficult to talk about languages at school, because it's just we have a school crisis since 3 years, governmental crisis and every possible crisis in Germany anyway. Mm-hmm. That's not only the languages, it's just mm-hmm. Nowadays it looks like the whole system is broken.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, at the same time, I have to say, sitting here in California, we also have a very, very multilingual environment. The children at the school where my children go, almost every child has multiple languages, yet the school system, this elementary school, for the entire 5-6 years that it serves students, does not teach any other language. So we have the same kind of constellation where we have a gap between the lived reality and the institutions and how they present languages. One aspect that this comes out in your book, I think, also very nicely, is the emotional dimension that these structures impose on people. And I think in Ambika's translation, the word shame came up. And I was quite struck by that. You speak about the shame and I guess also the anxiety of making a mistake in speaking German. But you also have this really interesting anecdote about the moment you lost that shame. And I was wondering if you could speak about that and talk about that for a moment, how you lose the shame as a, towards in this monolingual context of being, having an unsettled relationship to your language.
I was always ashamed for my German because, I was told so many times it's not a proper German, or I would talk with an accent, or there was something wrong about my German. And then I was spending half a year studying in Moscow, and there was a German guy, and he was struggling to buy tickets. He had really the worst English I ever heard, even for German standards. And he was really, really trying hard to buy these tickets. And I was just feeling ashamed and pity for him. So I helped him to buy the tickets in Russian. And then he immediately, he thanked me and said that I would talk German very well. I was just looking at him, but I can't really say that your German is good or that any of your languages are why do you blame me? And this was actually the second where I just completely lost the shame. And also, then again, my first book got published, and it was called Migration Author, a total conversation I didn't understood till today. And then again, 2015 happened in Germany, and after 2015, I haven't been asked once about my background. And since 2015, I'm officially German.
So because a new diversity has emerged, it has shifted, so you really experience the fluidity of what it means to be German and included. That's something that really also comes out in your book really, really nicely. In terms of the literature, that was maybe the final question from me before we move on. So your fictional worlds are filled with, multilingual environments and individuals, but you choose to write about them in German. As you say, I live a multilingual life, but I write monolingual. I'm a monolingual writer in German. And one of the issues that has been discussed is what are the factors that lead to that kind of, the path from this monolingual life to this multilingual life, to this monolingual writing. And you describe, your particular relationship to German. But beyond that, I was wondering, as an author on the literary market dealing with presses, is there also an issue of the expectations of trade publishers? Are there pressures where, it makes you choose or not choose to incorporate some other languages or not? Is that something that you have encountered? Is there something, you could say about that?
Basically, it was never really necessary for my literature work to include other languages. Also, it never really made sense. I can't really say that I would that I would never do it in my work, and I will never go back. But there was never this question as a question of a technique. It was never raised. It never occurred to me that I really need to do it multilingual. The only funny thing happened in my last novel, where I was really, for the first time in my life, translating from Russia, because most of the sources I was using were basically Russian. But again, the sources which I was using in Russian, they were basically also translation from the Caucasian languages, especially from Avarian, and also like a lot of translations from Turkish and the Old Osmanian. And this was really interesting. Also because like where I grew up culturally, it's so more close actually to the Ottoman republics and maybe to Russia. It was very weird. For the first time, it became really weird. And then I was really confused about the language and also about my own literally monolingualism, because it was the first time I like really thought, okay, there are really a lot of things underneath it, but also because it's also my Russian and my English, they would be never, or for now, they're not good enough to use it really as a language in writing. Like every time I'm writing an email in English, like I'm happy if somebody understands me, and this is basically my standard. For Russian, I'm very happy if I don't make any grammar mistakes, and also most of the times I'm just I'm dictating it to avoid mistakes. And also because I'm really frightened of doing mistakes in Russian because of this. There's like it's a really big difference making a mistake in English, which is kind of totally okay if nobody would blame it on me, or nothing I have to be, I feel shame. But in Russian, something else. In Russian, I have to constantly prove. I don't know, it's difficult. Also, it's very difficult to make a mistake in Russian rather than in English. It also depends on the surrounding, but in an educational context, it's not easy. So this question is quite a difficult one, and I think also the answer changes over the time.
Well, thank you. I think this might be a wonderful transition to actually hearing from that book that you just mentioned.
Yeah, we're thank you both. We're transitioning to a work, Der verlorene Sohn, Olga Krasnova's most recent book, and she will read from this, and you will, in the course of the discussion, I'm sure, recognize similar themes there. This language and identity, multilingualism, and so on are also topics that appear in this book. It's a historical novel set in the 19th century. I'll let Olga introduce it herself.
Yes, it's a novel which is basically between the Caucasus, especially between the Dagestan and the Avarian area, and Russia, St. Petersburg. And it's about the oldest son of Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil was he was one of the first people who really who tried to fight the Russian occupation of the Caucasus, and he got quite successful also with his tactics. And his oldest son, Jamaluddin, who is the main character of the novel, he was taken as a prisoner of war by the Russian government, and by the Tsar, and he was sent to St. Petersburg, where he spent 15 years. He got educated in St. Petersburg. He was having quite a privileged life, and the whole idea was to have him grow up with as much understanding for Russia as it could happen. So it worked quite well. And then at a certain point, Jamaluddin was supposed to go back to Caucasus because his father took prisoners, and they were supposed to exchange. And Jamaluddin is already 22 years. He hasn't, quite older, 25. He hasn't seen his family for 15 years. He don't have any news, and he's now in Georgia and waits to go home. And maybe just the other, it's like the Georgian prince. He's called David, and David, he's also waiting for his family to get back from the Caucasus. Februar 1855. Jamaluddin wurde im Stadthaus des Prinzen Javzadze einquartiert. Wahrscheinlich hatte der Prinz Angst. Jamaluddin würde es sich doch noch anders überlegen und versuchte daher, Jamaluddin nicht aus den Augen zu lassen. Das Haus hatte 2 Stockwerke und eine Veranda, die mit aufwendigen Schnitzereien verziert war. Das Innere hing voller Porträts der ehrwürdigen Ahnen, die einst georgische Könige und Königinnen gewesen waren. David allerdings würde niemals König werden, genauso wenig wie seine Kinder. Jamaluddin auch nicht, denn er hatte gehört, dass sein Vater seinen jüngeren Bruder Mohammed Ghazi als seinen Nachfolger gewählt hatte. Als erstes dankte der Prinz Jamaluddin in seinem Arbeitszimmer dafür, dass er sich gegen seine Familie austauschen ließ. Jamaluddin nickte, doch er fand die von David gewählte Formulierung seltsam. Wahrscheinlich hatte sich bereits die Legende von Jamaluddins Opfer gebildet. Niemand konnte sich offensichtlich vorstellen, dass seine Gefangenschaft nicht im Kaukasus, sondern in Russland beginnen könnte. Dennoch machte Jamaluddin David nicht darauf aufmerksam, sondern sah ihm vorbei auf die brennenden Holzscheite im Kamin. Jamaluddin hatte Mitleid mit ihm. Er schien von der ganzen Situation überfordert zu sein. »Möchten Sie noch Wein?« fragte David ihn. »Den guten Georgischen?« fragte Jamaluddin und hoffte, David würde seine Anspielung bemerken und verneinen. »Natürlich«, David lächelte. »Natürlich«, wiederholte Jamaluddin. »Die Verhandlungen verzögern sich«, sagte David und seufzte. »Weshalb?« »Ihr Vater fordert 1 Million Rubel.« Jamaluddin lachte auf, als er die Summe hörte, aber David sprach ungerührt weiter. »Ich sagte ihm bereits, dass ich nicht mehr als 40.000 aufbringen kann, und selbst das ist mehr, als ich eigentlich bezahlen kann.« Jamaluddin blieb sitzen, obwohl er sich durch diesen Viehhandel entehrt fühlte. Jamaluddin hatte David hatte seine jüngste Tochter verloren, die doch ein Säugling war, und fürchtete um das Leben seiner Frau, seiner Kinder und seiner Schwägerin. Jamaluddin hatte kein Recht, ihm eine Szene zu machen. David könnte sich eines Tages mit einem Duell rächen. Allerdings, wenn sein Vater ihn wirklich so unbedingt sehen wollte, spielte es da eine Rolle, wie viel man ihn für seinen Sohn zahlen würde. Jamaluddin müsste den Würgereiz unterdrücken. Er genoss die langen Spaziergänge durch die Stadt, auf welchen der Prinz ihn meistens begleitete und ihm die Stadt zeigte, die so anders war als Petersburg. Manchmal schlich sich Jamaluddin nach dem Spaziergang mit dem Prinzen wieder hinaus und ging noch einmal los, sah sich die Straßen und die Menschen an, hing seinen Gedanken nach. Doch meistens lief er stumm neben David her. Tiflis war eine Stadt, die sich auf mehreren Ebenen verteilte. Kleine Häuser und Kirchen drängten sich an den beiden Ufern des Flusses. Die Luft fühlte sich mild an, der Frühling war bereits zu spüren. Es war kalt, aber die Kälte war so viel milder als in Petersburg oder in Warschau. Wenn sie nebeneinander durch das Labyrinth aus schmalen, sich schlängenden Straßen herliefen, schwiegen sie. Sie hatten einander nicht viel zu sagen. Jamaluddin wollte nichts über das Leiden von Davids Familie hören und David wollte nicht, dass Jamaluddin seine Entscheidung noch einmal überdenken würde. Als sie in dem Gebäude, das von Giovanni Scudieri unterrichtet worden war, vorbeiging, wurde David gesprächiger. »Er gestaltet gerade die ganze Stadt um«, sagte David. »Wer?« David hatte Jamaluddin aus seinen Träumen gerissen. David erklärte Jamaluddin alles noch einmal und dieses Mal besonders langsam. Der italienische Architekt. Die Stadtmauern werden niedergerissen, Museen, Bibliotheken und ein Theater gebaut, erzählte David aufgeregt. Jamaluddin nickte. Auch eine Straße wird angelegt, sagte David, und seine Brust hob und senkte sich vor Stolz. Ein Boulevard nehme ich an. Jamaluddin gab sich Mühe, den richtigen Ton zu treffen. Ich hätte dort auch ein Haus in Auftrag gegeben, ebenfalls von Scudieri entworfen. Es sollte in 2 Jahren fertiggestellt worden, aber das war natürlich vor der Forderung meines Vaters. Jamaluddin schaute ihm in die Augen. David wirkte, als ob er noch etwas sagen wollte, aber nicht recht wusste, wie. Es wäre ein schönes Haus geworden. Da bin ich mir sicher. Jamaluddins Stimme klang bissig. David schaute ihn unsicher an und sprach dann weiter, als ob nichts wäre. Aber wissen Sie, Jamaluddin, ist es egal, ob das Haus gebaut wird oder nicht? Ich glaube ohnehin, dass sich hier bald viel verändern wird. Georgien wird moderner werden. David senkte die Stimme. Ich habe gehört, dass es einen Anschluss an die transkaukasische Eisenbahn geben wird. Dann werden die Immobilienpreise explodieren. Tiflis wird zum Zentrum werden. Es ist schade. Doch David hörte Jamaluddin nicht zu. Mir wurde wirklich versichert, von der höchsten Stelle. 2 Wochen später waren die Behandlungen immer noch keinen Schritt weitergekommen. Jamaluddin stand am Fenster und schaute hinaus. Das Sonnenlicht übergoss alle Gegenstände in seinem Zimmer und Gamzat lief im Garten auf und ab, in dem es Rosenstöcke und Obstbäume gab. Der Garten verwilderte seit der Abwesenheit der Prinzessinnen. Die Zweige wurden nicht mehr zurückgeschnitten, die Blätter noch sporadisch von den Wegen gehakt und das Unkraut eroberte sich sein Lebensraum zurück. Auch Jimlysins Cousin sollte ausgetauscht werden. Nur war er auf einer anderen Route nach Georgien gebracht worden. Hier wirkte er wie ein Fremdkörper, überhaupt nicht mehr so selbstgewiss wie in Petersburg. Seine Körpersprache war unsicher, die Schultern eingesunken, der Rücken gekrümmt. In den letzten Jahren war es Gamsat in Russland nicht besonders gut ergangen. Obwohl keiner der beiden einen Versuch unternommen hatte, mit dem anderen Kontakt aufzunehmen, hatte Jimlyssin die Neuigkeiten aus Gamsats Leben verfolgt. Jimlyssin blieb noch eine ganze Weile am Fenster stehen, ohne in den Garten hinaufzugehen. Für den Abend war eine Gala im neu errichteten Gouverneurspalais geplant. Trotz der schwierigen Verhandlungen wurde jeden Abend irgendwo ein Ball, eine Gala und ein Souper gegeben. Auf Jimlyssin wirkte es fast, als ob die russischen Militärangehörigen fieberhaft nach Gelegenheiten suchten, der provinziellen Langeweile zu entkommen. Jimlyssin trug die russische Uniform, der nicht wusste, wann der Offizier aus der Armee entlassen würde. Noch war ein Teil von ihr. Er hielt Ausschau nach Gamsat, doch der war nicht zu sehen. Während des Abendessens wurde er gegenüber von David gesetzt. Kurze Reden und lange Toasts wurden gehalten. David, schon sichtlich angetrunken, sagte, Jimlyssin sei russischer als die Russen und dass ihm vom ganzen Herzen für seine Tapferkeit danke. Er beendete eine Rede mit dem Toast auf Jimlyssin, einen Europäer, einen von uns. Alle Gäste standen auf und prosteten Jimlyssin zu. Als sie sich wieder hinsetzten, lobte David Jimlyssin Französisch, was Jimlyssin verwunderte, denn er beherrschte die Sprache deutlich besser als David. Selbst sein Russisch war sauberer. Statt David zu antworten, wie es von ihm erwartet wurde, ließ Jimlyssin sich lieber Wein nachschenken. Am anderen Ende des Tisches ging ein Teller zu Bruch. Einer der Gäste, ein stämmiger Mann mit Glatze und großen roten Händen, fasste sich in die Brust und sank langsam nach vorn. Einige Menschen sprangen von ihren Stühlen auf und eilten zu ihm. Der Mann röchelte, jemand schrie nach einem Arzt. Eine Frau zog an ihre Perlenkette, die Kette riss, und die Perlen rieselten auf den Boden. Eine andere Frau fächerte sich Luft zu. Die übrigen Gäste, auch Jimlyssin, saßen weiterhin auf ihren Plätzen, aber dann lief er zu dem Mann und half, ihn auf den Boden zu legen. David öffnete den Hemdkragen des Kranken, doch dessen Gesicht hatte die Farbe bereits gewechselt. Jemand schüttete ihm Wasser ins Gesicht. Irgendwann kam auch der Arzt, und der Sterbende wurde in ein anderes Zimmer gebracht. Jimlyssin ging hinaus in den Garten, um frische Luft zu schöpfen. Es war eine sternklare Nacht. Plötzlich hörte er ein Geräusch hinter sich. Er drehte sich um und sah hinter den Platanen zwei Gestalten auftauchen. Beide trugen die dunklen Kleider und die Kopfbedeckung Dagestans. Yunus, fragte Jimlyssin unsicher, die Hand noch immer an seinem Säbel. Er wusste nicht, ob er träumte oder ob es tatsächlich Yunus war. Die Wirklichkeit zerrann zwischen seinen Fingern. Yunus lächelte und kam auf Jimlyssin zu, nahm seine Hände und schaute ihn aufmerksam ins Gesicht. Dann drehte Jimlyssins linke Hand um und fuhr mit seinem Zeigefinger über die Narbe auf der Hand. Die Zeit hatte auch für Yunus nicht Halt gemacht, aber es war noch immer Yunus. Jimlyssin atmete tief ein und aus. Das bist wirklich du, sagte Yunus und sprach danach einige Sätze auf Awarisch, denen Jimlyssin nicht gleich folgen konnte. Seine vermeintliche Muttersprache schien mit einem Mal verschwunden zu sein, obwohl es die Sprache war, in der sich ihm die Welt zum ersten Mal erschlossen hatte, in der er mit seinem Vater und seiner Mutter kommuniziert hatte. Eine Sprache, deren Wörter sein kleiner Bruder ihm langsam nachgesprochen hatte, ließ ihn jetzt im Stich. Doch das gab ihm Zeit, Yunus Begleiter zu betrachten. Er war noch jung und hatte ebenmäßige Gesichtszüge, zumindest sofern Jimlyssin dies im Mondlicht sehen konnte. Der junge Mann hatte noch keinen Ton von sich gegeben und starrte lediglich voller Verachtung Jimlyssins Uniform an. Auch Yunus war sie nicht entgangen, doch was hatten sie eigentlich erwartet? Weshalb kamen sie erst jetzt? Nun kann ich deinem Vater endlich die Botschaft überbringen. Er wird sehr glücklich sein. Yunus küsste Jimlyssin auf die Wange. Jimlyssin wollte ihm sagen, dass David niemals die nötige Summe würde aufbringen können, aber ihm fehlten die Worte. Wir sehen uns bald wieder, sagte Yunus und verschwand mit seinem Begleiter in der Dunkelheit. Als Jimlyssin wieder hineinging, sah Gamsat am Fenster stehen und hinunterschauen. Er musste ihn beobachtet haben. Jimlyssin betrat den inzwischen menschenleeren Empfangssaal, setzte sich an sein Klavier und spielte eine einzige Note. Immer und immer wieder drückte dieselbe Taste. Soweit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start with a very general question. It's a historical novel, and so it's a bit of a departure from your earlier work. And as I read it, I was struck by the modernity of the topics discussed in it. And I was curious because I see many points or many themes that kind of link to issues that we're dealing with today. And I was curious what specifically drew you to that topic. Was it the modernity? Was it a desire to delve into the history of the Caucasus?
That was exactly this modernity of the questions. When I first found the story of Jamaluddin, I thought like it's something unique, and then I figured out actually how much was already written on this topic. And then I started to read more, and I was really stunned by the complexity and the modernity of the questions which were raised there and which we're still dealing with, also in Caucasus, in Russia, and to some extent also in Germany, because it's also like a topic which also I think is quite relevant to the German society, the question of identity, of belonging, on being part of an identity. And on a certain point, I even had the feeling that actually the Russian society back then might be a little bit more modern than the society of today, at least the way how we perceive being Russian, or what actually being Russian means. It was really stunning just to see that everything which is considered Russian today is actually not Russian at all, at least in the terms of today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was struck as I was looking at the books for today. I was struck by a sentence actually in Die Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit. Anpassung kostet eine unglaubliche Mühe. Es ist kein fröhlicher Prozess. So assimilation takes an incredible effort, and it is not a joyful process. And this is something that clearly plays a big role in Der verlorene Sohn, because Jamaluddin is the son of a leader in the Caucasus, the leader of the fight against Russia. And so he is handed over as a hostage with the hope of educating him and perhaps turning him into a puppet ruler who can then kind of, make sure the Caucasus is part of the Russian Empire, because he's educated by Russia and becomes a Russian. And so this question of assimilation is a crucial one in the book. And he forgets his native language gradually. He is also, so there are again these questions that are very modern. How much does he want to change? And there's some resistance on his part, but then also how much does society allow him to change? How much is he considered exotic and therefore excluded from society, and much as he would like to be a part of them. So it's this constant tug of war, and it's always about this in-between, being in between cultures, not really belonging to either one, which really makes it a very modern topic. But then he's also a very exceptional case, in many ways, a very extreme case, because he is the leader and the son of a leader. And so this potential of using him as their little marionette in the Caucasus, that's the 1 in a million kind of scenario. And so he is flattered and treated, with the utmost respect, and at the same time constantly manipulated. So I was curious about this bizarre dialectic. And, in many ways, it's so similar to what anybody experiences who is transplanted and plunked down in a different culture. But then it's also so very, very different because of this specific case. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Exactly this what was so fascinating for me in writing the story also. Of course, on the one hand, it's basically what I'm experiencing. And on the other hand, I can always hide behind the fact that it's just, it's just something special. And then again, that I really, that I didn't have to think of anything, like basically it's really based on historical facts, and everything I did was just a mere interpretation, which is of course the basis for the whole idea, but all the facts are true, and I invented only 2 characters. Everything else is as accurate as it could get, at least from my perspective and from my non-scholar possibilities. And also when I discovered how the story was, of course, because the story is so exotic and so interesting, so I was really not the first one to do it, and it was really it was also interesting to see who was dealing with the story and how, and it was mainly used as a popular story, like not really for literature but more for popular stories. But the whole time when I was reading it, it was being described and Jamaluddin goes to Russia, and suddenly he loves everything about Russian. He tries to be as Russian as he can be, and he's over-identifying with the society. And I thought it can't be really true. If he's already 9 when he goes to Russia, and he was basically raised to hate Russians and just to defeat them, I didn't really saw that it adds up. Again, also, it's of course the modern psychology, the contemporary psychology behind it, but it's also like a historical novel. It's never really about history. It's more about contemporary, about being as contemporary and trying to hide behind the past and just say something about our world. So I was also talking a lot to psychologists to get their opinion about I don't know this term in English, but it's called Bindungstheorie in German, like the attachment theory, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and how he can get attached to a new world without really forgetting his own family and without feeling as a traitor. And since I knew how the whole story will end, it was just a lot of fun for me to see the crush.
Yeah. I mean, that is a particularly interesting part, that when he goes back to his own culture, his own culture is already a misnomer here. When he goes back where he grew up, he doesn't fit in either. So there's this in between, which is really quite intriguing, and to see how that's developed on a psychological level, it makes for a very intriguing character. Now I'm curious, since you brought it up, one of my questions was actually how beholden did you feel to the archives that you're using, because you actually include a bibliography in the end of the various sources that you consulted. So it's clear that you have a lot of knowledge about the period, and there are lots of references to contemporary figures, including, you have a little scene with the famous fake execution stage to freak Dostoevsky out. And so you have a lot of contemporary references, a lot of fascinating details. So you clearly, have absorbed the historical record. But then you mentioned you invented 2 characters, and now, of course, I'm curious which ones you invented.
Just some of the friends.
And the
environment. The Apollon is, I think just Apollon and some of the couple of the boys he's playing with when he's little. But it's also when I was reading all this novel or this short stories about Jamaluddin, which were written before, one of the things which disturbed me were that they were not really historically accurate. And I don't know, it's of course it's a matter of days basically, but for me it was very strange. The first novel where I discovered the story of Jamaluddin, it was basically about his father and the Georgian princesses he held as a hostage. And then it was still the 19th centuries, and these princesses, they were like 35, 38 years old. For that time, it was quite old for a woman. And they had 5 kids. And still in this novel, the contemporary novel, it was presented, they've been almost so close of being a virgin. and then there were author, which it's a wonderful novel, but she was always playing between, there should be love story between Imam Shamil and this Georgian princess, which sounds ridiculous to me. I don't know, it's somehow there was something which was really I couldn't believe it. And then again, because I couldn't believe it, I started to write my own novel, because when I when I really found the story, and when I knew that he dies so young, and I knew that his homecoming is just horrible, for me it was like the most exciting part. What happens when he was trying to hold back part of him, and then this part is actually not necessary. Nobody really can deal with his homecoming, and him. Everybody, most of the people are thinking he's basically a spy for the Russian. And then again, also his behavior was like one of the spy. This was where my interest was. And with the historical research, I don't really know. Like, I'm not quite sure if there really that much in the archives, or I just didn't find it. I was trying, and also I included the list of the sources, because there's always a fight about the sources and which ones to use. It's always also quite a statement. I see maybe even on the history in the Caucasus. And then I just decided that just the main sources which were the most seemed the most reliable to me were actually the sources which were in the Russian one from the Averroian authors. They seem to be the most accurate one, and that's why I decided to include it.
Another issue that really was interesting to me is, and again, sort of to me speaks to the modernity of the issues that you're dealing with, is this conflict between a dominant culture and various minorities. And you portray St. Petersburg as this cosmopolitan elite, essentially, or at least that you portray part of, the court in St. Petersburg as this cosmopolitan elite. And to go back to the question of multilingualism, they're certainly multilingual. The Tsar's families from Germany at the speak French and English and German, and Jamaluddin comes in speaking a language that nobody knows, Avaric. So there is this conflict between, the provinces and the cosmopolitan capital, and yet at the same time you also very, very clearly show that in St. Petersburg it's built, this empire is built on the exploitation of slave labor. So, and you see, on the one hand, the splendor of the palace, and you have wonderful details there. They're shipping in fresh flowers from France in heated carriages and so on, which I'm sure is based on historical sources. And but you also describe how on the way to the palace, they're surrounded by beggars. So you have this extreme contrast between rich and poor. But then what's intriguing is that Jamaluddin's own culture isn't portrayed as this positive, Rousseauistic, alternative where everything is just wonderful. His father, Shamil, seems to also be somewhat autocratic, to put it mildly. Violent, he has multiple wives. They're in many ways, the advances of science and technology have completely passed them by. In terms of medicine, you have an episode where one of his daughters suffers from an injury that she really wouldn't have to suffer from, and that is ultimately treated then with Russian knowledge. So it's constantly about the struggle, what is civilized, and who gets to represent civilization. And there's also the look from the provinces toward the capital, where I thought this one scene was particularly memorable, where Jamaluddin looks at the German custom Christmas tree, and thinks, you're worshiping a tree, who's the heathen here, who's pagan now? And so it's constantly about this question of civilization. And it seems to me, if I understood this correctly, that you sort of, you don't present one culture as the truly civilized. You sort of show sort of how complicated that question actually is.
I mean, but also like always this discussion about the civilized, it's of course, or civilization, it's highly problematic, because like who is actually defining what civilization is? It's always the ones who got the victory, and it was like always like all the whole wars which were which were officially were put for the sake of civilization. It's always, of course, very difficult and very questionable motivation. And also again, in the book I had also the problem of the perspective, because it's always stayed very close to Jamaluddin, so I couldn't really switch to show his home as what it might be. So there was no, I had the choice between showed maybe historical better and balanced, or just to have a better character in the figure. So I decided for the sake of the character. And also, like, there's also one scene where actually when his father is presented, and also the surrounding of Shamil was multicultural, and he was able to speak a lot of several languages, but not the ones which were spoken in Russia or in Europe. And also Jamaluddin got very much surprised when he realized it, and then he felt shame that he didn't really consider his father as a scholar. And Shamil was also a scholar. He was one of the best scholars on Islam of his time, I guess. But again, there was this problem of perspective. And also, especially the legacy of Shamil is also problematic today. He's still, for a lot of people, he's a hero, and for a lot of people, he is considered as the source of the whole problems which a lot of regions of the world are still dealing with. For example, the Islamism and the whole extremism which wasn't there before him. Or he was also one of the first ones who really invented the new interpretation of jihad. He was one of the first ones who used it for war, which wasn't known before. Yeah, I mean, of course, the jihad was known, but it was more a duty for the right path of life rather than going to war. Mm-hmm. And he was like dealing with it as a mean of war.
I should say that we, as always, we want to make sure that people can put their own questions in the chat. So please, if you have any questions, and they can be about either text, please put them in the chat. Denis has one. I'm just going to read that. I'm interested in following up on Yasemin's initial question about the publication and format of Die Macht der Mehrsprachigkeit. It strikes me as revolutionary intervention that this essay was published by Duden Verlag, the bastion of standardization of German language. So congratulations. But what does our celebration of multilingualism and nuances mean for standards of speaking and writing languages well? Furthermore, how can personal experience, poetic narration, archival, scholarly research work together to counter the monolingual paradigm of pure language? Moving forward, how can we maintain the multilingual archives that feed the power fiction and at the same time help foster the creativity of kids like Özcan? So that's a mouthful, but maybe I'll read the question again. So what does our celebration of multilingualism and nuances mean for standards of speaking and writing languages well? So perhaps we can start with that.
Well, it depends. It really depends. It depends if we actually really need the standard, and who needs the standards and what for. For example, I think I have the standard only in one language, and it's clearly German. And sometimes, for example, when I'm in Frankfurt and when I hear people talking there in the dialect, I'm always like really surprised. And I'm looking at them, but you're German, you should really know that your grammar is just shit, but basically then I remember, okay, it's a dialect. And it's also like, of course, like there are no, especially with German, there's no standard German. There's just something we consider being standard, but it's just one register of German. It's also very, one which of a very certain area in Germany and a certain class. And for example, more. There are also a lot of people from a monolingual German families, which we are sometimes calling referring to as pure German. They have more troubles in universities as people who learn German later because of the habitus, and because everything else which comes into language. And I'm not sure if, for example, for multilingual kids in Germany, if they really need this high standard in every single language, because sometimes it's just about communication. And we never consider, for example, if we just take monolingual German kids in school, we're mostly happy if they're able to write like 5 sentences in French or 15 sentences in Spanish. It's considered as enough. I passed my Latin exams without knowing less than 10 sentences in Latin, which I could translate. And I still got my Latino. And it's also like, I'm not sure if it really needs all the standards. Maybe later if we need them for, I don't know, research, but you can always build on something. And also I don't think, for example, with me, all my languages are, sometimes one of my languages is weaker as the other one. It's changed also a lot. When I'm in Russia, my Russian, after 2 days, Russian is almost, I start to forget German and more Russian comes up. And I'm pretty sure if I would move to somewhere else, my German would become really bad immediately. Because it's always the first thing I forget is the German grammar. It's just gone, like it was never there. But also in a different surrounding, my English slightly becomes better. But I don't know, I don't think it's even my level of languages. It's changes sometimes weekly.
We have a whole bunch of questions. There's one from Jonathan Skolnick, picking up on Yasemin's question about multilingual life and monolingual writing. My question is, as a writer, do you think about or anticipate translations of your work into Russian or other languages, as you write in German? Are you interested in the reception of your works in translation?
Hi, Jonathan. Very much, but I was never translated into Russian, and I don't have the feeling this will ever happen. It's very interesting for me, but then again, most of the languages I got translated to, I can't read or I can't understand.
Mm-hmm. Do you think about translations, though, when you're writing works in German? Do you give any thought to translations, or is that
not at all? For example, my husband does it because he writes in Arabic, and he knows, and because it's very difficult to find a good translator from Arabic into German, so he always, sometimes when he writes a text, he knows that it has to be written in a way it could be translated with as much loss as possible. Mm-hmm. But I think German is way more uncomplicated than Arabic. Mm-hmm. Also not a very hard language to learn. Like, it's not super complicated, it's quite simple.
Our students might disagree. Lina writes, this is not about the book, but what do you think will be the language of the future? Or will we continue to have a multitude of languages? I'm a Russian Lithuanian myself, raising kids in the US with a Spanish-speaking spouse, and I'm not sure what to teach them for a second or third language.
But I think it's basically already English. I mean, but I think also it's very good because, for example, we can have this conversation tonight, which would be probably not possible without English.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, it's really like now, even like every time I'm sitting in this Russian school, like Russian afternoon classes or Sunday Arabic school, which my kids are attending, the combinations are so, in comparison to my own upbringing, like all those language combinations are really so weird. And like, you can find everything now, like any single possible combination. It was like actually the whole dream. Like my first year grammar book in Russia, it was in Russian. It was like all this, the friendship of the nations. Of course, it was like a big lie. It never worked out. But I think that today we're actually closer to it because there's so many variations of dialects, of origins, and in every single, like, it became really transcultural.
Mm-hmm. Michael Goodman writes the Saxon German dialect is also considered very non-standard German.
Yeah.
I can certainly speak to that, having grown up in Bavaria.
Yeah.
Odd to me just how many experiences you describe. I have similar experiences from growing up in a Bavarian speaking family because, you know, Bavarian is extremely different pronunciation and sometimes even its own vocab, and grammatically it's different. I remember, you know, calling it der Butter. So it's, you know, clearly there are very strong differences also because nobody questions that you're also German when you're from Bavaria and so on. But there are also similarities. And I think also particularly what you said earlier in terms of classism, you know, that there are very strong connotations as to which social class you belong to, and the kind of prestige that comes with various dialects and so on. So there is sort of a general hierarchy, which, you know, again brings in this question of language and power. You know, just how much power can you be expected to have if you speak a particular language as your first language? And we have, as you describe in your book, this odd situation where people are flocking to whatever Mandarin schools. You know, you mentioned Ivanka Trump having her children learn Mandarin, and then on the other hand, if somebody says, "I'll teach your children Serbo-Croatian for free," then it's no, thank you. So, you know, this extreme hierarchy that comes in. Any more questions in the chat?
Can I didn't see, but can I just go back to one thing that you said, and I'm unmuted, right? Okay. That you said, Olga, that you've come more and more to think of these issues of language, and you didn't use that term, but basically Stellvertreterkriege, so stand-ins really for issues of race, because it's not, you know, what languages or how many languages you speak, but who speaks it. So if the issue is one really at that level, then, you know, does that mean we can only resolve the issues by resolving racism, and then, you know, any kind of multilingual practices or anything doesn't really address the core problem? I was just wondering if you could say more what you think along those lines.
The problem is, I'm not sure myself yet what actually the problem is. It's just a suspicion. Because it's also like, first I was thinking clear. It seemed to me clear that, of course, there's this very strict hierarchy on languages, which language are regarded, which have a social prestige and which not. But then again, like, for example, if it's just English, it's only a certain type of English which is regarded as proper English, for example. And I think even I found not long ago, somebody explained to me, or I found a caption, who is actually regarded as a native speaker in English. And it's always a citizen of a certain countries, and the first language should be English. But for example, if you grew up as a first, if I'm not mistaken, for example, if you grew up in India and your first language is English, you're still not considered a native speaker. It was kind of an official explanation, definition of being a native speaker in English. And this is also very surprising. It's even more because it's always it's not only our idea about the hierarchy of languages, but also it's the issue of race, who has the agency to claim a language for themselves and who is excluded from this privilege. It's the same with French. When there are more French speakers outside of France than we see in France, still in Europe, but it's also very centristic. Like, still, the French, which is taught, I think, also in North America and in Europe, it's just French from France, which is, of course, just from a very certain social class, and just the pronunciation, which is only from Paris, or like all try to imitate this pronunciation. And the same with Spanish. it's maybe a little bit less strict with Spanish than with other languages, but also because Spanish got considered as a privileged language just recently. I'm quite sure it's going to change too. And so, and it's easier with Russian because we don't have that many variations of Russian actually at all. It's maybe just a dialect of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but basically it just doesn't really matter in Russian. And also because I think the Russian school system, it's much more standardized than the German or everything else. It's easier. And also like every time we have this discussion about proper German within Germany, it's always it's just certain people who don't speak it properly. And also Mohammed Amjahid made this example with Arabic when for a job a native speaker in Arabic is required, or this agency of speaking Arabic on a high level, who's getting the job. Like really somebody who's a native speaker in Arabic, or like a white German who learned or almost always not learned this language, and whom do we believe? And it's usually based on race, I think, in Germany, but it's just, I'm not really sure about it. I didn't really examine it in so far. Mm-hmm. And it's always also claiming that this German is proper, this German is not proper. Also, to whom we're using this means of Halbsprachigkeit, of being not able to speak one language properly. It's like a weapon always, which is used. It's another way of saying you don't belong to us. It's another way of saying exactly the same things, like don't speak proper, and there's no biological possibility for you to speak it any proper. It's basically the same, like from still from the nativism, when we started to see the Germanness as being German as something biological. It's still related to the German language. It's still something you should acquire only biological. And even if you're born in Germany and you acquired the language there and quite biologically, even so, if you're not from there German blood, you can't speak German properly. It's still what I think is the fundament of the whole discussions we're having, which is ridiculous. And of course, nobody would ever put it this way, but it's still, I think, quite the same thing we're discussing.
Yes, and this kind of pivots back a little bit to Der verlorene Sohn, but what struck me about it is that Jamaluddin forgets his native language, the language he grew up with as he is in St. Petersburg, but he is unwilling to convert from Islam to Christianity, or at least, refuses for a long time. And it was sort of interesting to me that it sort of left me with the feeling that religion is the last thing to go in the way it's presented. Is that something you were thinking about, sort of religion as part of your identity, as in connection to language as part of your identity?
No, I think it's something else. I grew up in a Jewish family in Russia, and it was always like the thing which was always unimaginable for us would to convert to Christianity. This was like a line we would never cross. Even so, nobody was religious whatsoever, but this was like really like a line which would never be crossed, ever. Doesn't matter what happens. I don't know, it was like just the thing I was born to. And also because like I grew up in a society which was mainly Muslim. And this whole thing, being religious, it was never really an issue. And we never really had a lot of anti-Semitism, or actually in comparison to Russia, basically no anti-Semitism at all, or no really discussions about religion until 1989. 89, like till the first pogroms on the Armenians. It was. And I think it was always, and I thought it might not have been that different back then, and also like I wrote, also like found some of the documents where it was actually described how he struggled either to convert or not to convert. And there have been two sources which claimed that he really wanted to convert, but also the sources were so strange and quite nationalistic. So I thought it's like strange. Mm-hmm. And also he was like the son of an imam. I don't think he would have converted that easily.
Thank you. We're out of time. If there's one last question, we can handle it. But yeah. But I do think it also, Jana Schmidt writes, but I do think it also has something to do with the ethics of monolingualism versus the political values that might come with multilingualism. As an example, when I go to visit Germany from my home in the US, people in my family and others take note that I can no longer speak properly because I have an accent on some words or because my intonation and usage has become Americanized, meaning that I use German differently than the standard, something which is, of course, actually the source of poetic variation. Do you think there's an ethics of multilingualism that implies political plurality?
I don't know. Also, my problem is I'm totally tone deaf. So like, I really never can get a mispronunciation in any language because like usually I just don't recognize it. For example, every time when people are confessing to me they're not German native speakers, I didn't hear that. Especially like in Switzerland or in Bavaria, where I'm really struggling to understand people because I just don't speak the dialect. I grew up in Hessen, it's the only dialect I can deal with. So everything else sounds to me always strange, but it's the same in Russian. I was always claimed when I was in Russia that there's something wrong with my Russian. And they say it once that my accent was American, the other time it was French, then it was Polish, and then it was German. So I'm not quite sure about this claiming an accent to be an accent, actually. It's probably possible to really recognize it in linguistic terms, but I'm too uneducated about linguistics, so it's probably possible to really define it in linguistic terms, but it's also like for a tone deaf person like me, it's all the same.
There is certainly, I think it's also about a certain quest for purity, that you can really reach, and it is often related to political discourses. I think we all remember the comments about, God, which politician was it who said, they speak English in Berlin cafes, the waiters.
Jens Spahn.
Yeah, Spahn.
In Bavaria, I guess.
It's always about negotiating who gets to belong and who doesn't belong. And it's always about questions of power. And it's usually standards of purity that, that where nobody really is fully in compliance. And certainly, like all of Bavaria would have to be cut off right away and could not be included. So it's a bizarre ideal.
And it's also because it was Jens Spahn, it's a strategy from the CDU, the Christian Democratic Parties, in 30 years or 40 or 50 to build the whole election campaign only about this purity, because basically there's no political agenda anymore left. And there's no conservatism or nothing to defend. And the only thing which is left is just to pretend we have this purity of language or this purity of the German Volkskörper or whatever. And this is always like the last exit. If you don't have any political agenda, you can always say, but look, the foreigners, or look, they don't even speak proper German, or look, the schools in Neukölln where nobody speaks German. It's in the whole country, nobody speaks German anymore. But not since yesterday, it's like demographic.
It's about what ties us together. If it's not the language, if it's not common ideals, what is it?
Which is a very, especially considering the German history, a very interesting discussion. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had this discussion once. It didn't end up really well.
All right. We're already over the time. Thank you so much, Frau Krasnova.
Thank you very much.
One last time, it's a very slim volume, And I do think it would really appeal to undergraduates also, because it combines scholarship with, personal stories and integrates complex concepts in a person's life and thinking. And so I think that would appeal to many. So on that note, thank you again, Frau Krasnova. Thank you, Jasmin.
Thank you very much.
And Karina. And we will continue this series, though we're still working on precisely with whom and when, but you will surely get announcements. So thank you everybody for coming, and we'll hope to see